Certain and Uncertain, Chapter 31, Return Trip. Gwen held her breath as the cradle opened and Jen stumbled forth. Verdona was right there waiting for her. She smiled and hugged her tight again. "How are you feeling?" She smiled. "Much better." Azimuth cleared his throat. Yes, quite good." He hopped onto Jen's wrist and spun the dial on the Omnitrix a few times. The ectoneurite DNA is intact, and it looks like your grandmother left you a bit of a surprise." Jen glanced down at the watch and her mouth dropped open. "No way. Really?" Verdona shrugged. "It won't put you on equal footing, since yours is temporary, but the universe could do with more beings like you and your cousin." Jen glanced at Azimuth with pleading eyes as Gwen and Kevin glanced at each other, confused. "Fine," the Galvan conceded. "Just try not to break anything." He hopped off her wrist and she slapped down the dial on the Omnitrix. Green lights flashed and didn't quite die down like normal. Instead, they coalesced into a bright green bob around a greenish-black face with bright white eyes. The Omnitrix symbol glowed at the center of a greenish-black chest as Jen giggled loudly and flew around the room, trailed by green mana. Gwen stared. Verdona shrugged. "One of my Earth grandchildren had to have the full form, and you refused." Jen crowed with excitement as she floated near the ceiling. "This feels fantastic! I can see so many colors! Why is everyone pink? Except me. Oh, I like being green. Does this make me weird? How do I get down?" Gwen burst out laughing. "This is the one form she's lousy at?" "I am not. I'm just not used to her yet." Verdona laughed and took Jen's hand, guiding her back to the floor. Her feet still refused to meet it, though. "She's a novice, Gwen. Be nice. If you could fly, you'd have gotten stuck the first few times, too. She needs training. But since I know she won't say yes to coming to Anodyne either, you'll have to show her the basics." Gwen nodded as Jen hit the Omnitrix symbol and reformed into herself. She ran a hand through her pixie cut and frowned. "Why is my hair so much longer as an Anodyne?" Grandma Verdona shook her head. "It's not really important, but a green Anodyne is something even I've never seen." She glanced at Azimuth. "It's likely due to the form only being accessible through the Omnitrix, which, as I've been told, has a green aura of its own and has passed that to Jen." Jen nodded. "Makes sense. We should head home. We didn't exactly tell anyone we were leaving." Verdona smiled. "Oh, that's easy enough." She snapped her fingers and they landed in the hole right in front of the computers. Pierce and Ethan jumped, but Max didn't seem fazed. He smiled. "Good to see you all in one piece. Next time, call." He turned to Verdona as Pierce and Ethan began to ask questions. "It's good to see you." "It's lovely to see you too, Max. You haven't changed." He shook his head. "Kind of you to say, but we both know that's not true." She shook her head and tapped him on the chest. "Not in here, Max. Never in here." Jen ushered the other teens out of the base to let Verdona and Max have a few moments alone together. Ethan took her hand. "What happened?" "A lot, but we should meet up with Julie, too. I have to get shipped back to her. How long were we gone?" Pierce counted on his fingers. "Day and a half?" he said like it was a question. "Max called us in about 12 hours ago." Ethan nodded. "He had us worried. The mole thing at the golf course was taken care of, but there was a giant crater in the parking lot." Jen nodded. "Yeah, we know. We'll tell the story when we get to Julie's." Ship beeped happily and formed the Vespa under Jen, taking off as she laughed loudly. Ethan managed to hop on the back as the others raced to Kevin's car, which was parked in its usual spot at the garage. A week passed, and suddenly it was time to prepare to go back to school, for those that still went, anyway. Pierce hadn't been in years, neither had Kevin. Ethan was transferring to Jen's school. Gwen was up to her neck in schoolwork and research about curing Kevin. She taught Jen a few basic spells, but much to her disappointment, she couldn't use any of her Andodite powers outside of the form. But she shouldn't have to use it too often. Gwen had also given her Charmcaster's old spellbook. It was easy to keep on her, and even easier for her to summon since she was familiar with it, and had been for years. Gwen had been using it for years, and knew most of the spells in it by heart. Jen and Julie were dragged out to shop for new school clothes by their parents, while Ethan and Gwen caught up on their reading. Jen was notorious for waiting until the last minute to do her reading, and it wasn't as though she could claim that she'd been spending the summer saving the universe, even though that was true. Kevin and Pierce were left to see to most of the plumber business, but it wasn't such a bad thing, at least not if you asked Kevin. He'd been tracking some interesting signs through town since they returned from Galvin Prime. Jen had quietly complained that Grandma Verdona had teleported them away before she could bother Azimuth about curing Kevin, but he'd waved her off. Stopping her from going homicidal had been priority at that moment. But he was back to wearing his ID mask almost everywhere. But the odd signs kept popping up, weird energy drains at the local power stations, whole factories going dark for nearly 10 minutes at a time. There were a few break-ins here and there, oddly enough, including a bookstore. It was a small place Gwen frequented, but they'd only taken a book from the rare books collection, nothing from the register. Kevin had an idea who this might be, and he wanted to take out some aggression on him if it was, so he kept his mouth shut. He didn't like the idea of Gwen facing up against the energy vampire anymore anyway. He told the girls he was heading out on patrol as he drove his car towards the old theatrical warehouse he'd narrowed down Darkstar's hiding place to. Chapter 32, Ripple Effect. Kevin didn't respond to their messages the next day. Gwen wasn't too worried. Kevin could handle himself. So they took Pierce as their fourth team member to track down the Forever Knights. They were too late to catch them, but they did find a few clues that might lead to their next target. As night fell, the team shared a smoothie at their regular spot, and Jen started feeling a little off. She shook her head. It was probably nothing. Then she stood to get the next round, and her legs gave out, and she collapsed. Everything hurt, and there was no cause. She cried out as pain intensified for a moment. Then everything was back to normal. She blinked. Gwen, Ethan, and Pierce were all gathered around her. What happened? Jen shook her head. I have no idea. Pierce helped her to her feet. That wasn't normal even for you. We need to get you to medical. Come on. Ethan took her other arm, and they helped her into Pierce's truck. He took her back to the hole, and they made their way down into the small medical bay. There were getting to be more and more people in these areas. The construction of the main plumber base on Earth was well underway, but so as not to disturb the current setup and possibly hinder the efforts of the main plumber station on Earth, the majority of the base was being built elsewhere, under Bellwood. But the medical facility was up and running. The doctors looked her over, but could find nothing wrong with her. I'm telling you, I feel fine. Whatever it is, it's gone. The doctor nodded. So it seems, but we'd like to keep you overnight for observation, since it occurred out of nowhere, just in case it happens again. Jen nodded to the Apollonite who was running the medbay. Fine. She pouted as the doctor turned back to his datapad. Rest, just for tonight. Your file says you don't like to rest, so we're breaking protocol a little and letting your friends in to see you, but only one can stay the night. Jen perked up as Gwen and Ethan entered the room. Pierce is filling out an incident report with Grandpa Max, Gwen explained. Jen frowned. Still no word from Kevin? Gwen shook her head. Not yet, but he's a big guy. He can take care of himself. Jen nodded. It was still odd that they couldn't get a hold of him. He usually kept his badge on. Jen shook her head. If he's not responding tomorrow, then we'll go out and find him. He can whine at me that he can do what he wants while he explains why he turned his stupid badge off. Gwen smiled. Thanks, Jen. Jen nodded to her cousin, who gave her a sly grin. I'll let you and Ethan have some alone time. She winked, and Ethan went bright red. Gwen closed the door behind her and chuckled. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. You sure you're okay? What did the doctor say? Jen smiled. I couldn't find anything wrong. I feel fine. They're going to keep me in overnight for observation, but just to be sure whatever it was doesn't happen again. Ethan nodded. That's good, right? Jen shrugged. Yeah, would be better if someone could tell me what happened. It really fucking hurt, whatever it was. Ethan reached out and took her hand. I'm sorry. Is there anything I can do to help? Jen grinned. You could come up here and cuddle with me. I'm stuck here for the night. Might as well have some company. Ethan smiled and glanced at the door. We won't get in trouble? Jen shrugged. Do we care? We're usually in trouble. At least that kind isn't likely to put a gun to our heads. Ethan snorted and settled onto the bed beside her as she grabbed the TV remote from the side table. "What do you want to watch?" Jen shrugged. "Not really picky right now. I'll probably fall asleep during it anyway." She flicked through the channels for a moment before settling on an action movie she'd seen a few times before. That was how Gwen found them in the morning, Jen fast asleep in Ethan's arms. She snapped a photo of them and texted it to Kevin with a message, "See what you miss when you up and disappear?" Still no response, though. She heard footsteps behind her and looked back to see Victor Validus coming down the hall. "Oh, hello, Gwen. Have you seen your grandpa? There's some notes about the tech we've recovered on an old base that I'd like a second opinion on." "I haven't seen him since day before yesterday. Sorry." Victor nodded and peeked over her shoulder and smiled at his son, who had shifted slightly so Jen was completely in his lap, snoring like she was going to wake the dead. "I swear he could sleep through the end of the world." Gwen laughed, and Jen jerked awake. "I'm up, Mum." She blinked and rubbed her eyes, a moment of panic flashing through them as she didn't immediately recognize her surroundings. But when she looked up at Ethan, she seemed to relax. "Not your mom, cuz." Gwen laughed. Victor smiled. "Good morning, Jen." The Apollinite doctor stepped up to the door. He raised a bright silver eyebrow. "I do hope you got some rest last night, Miss Tennyson." She nodded, rubbing her eyes, and nudged Ethan until he grumbled awake. He yawned wide and blinked. "Morning, sunshine." She made a face at him and gently shoved him off the bed. He squawked and laughed, tossing the pillow that had come off the bed with him at her. She laughed as the doctor came in to take her vitals. He pronounced her fine to leave. "Whatever it was, it's gone now. It doesn't seem to have had any long-lasting effects. Did you do anything unusual last night?" Jen shook her head. "Just the opposite. A routine bust that we were late for because Kevin didn't show. Then smoothies and planning to bust up the nights tonight. Nothing I don't do all the time." The doctor frowned. "Well, do your best to take it easy for a little while. If you absolutely have to be the one to go after the nights, take extra backup." Jen nodded, knowing that she was definitely going after the nights tonight. There was no way she was sitting this out. The Knights weren't even in her top 10 heavy-hitter bad guys since she'd beaten the Forever King when she was a kid. "I'll do that, Doc. Thanks." She hopped off the bed. "We need to find Kevin and Pierce." Gwen rolled her eyes as Jen snagged her shoes and jacket from where they sat by the door and pulled them on. "Pierce is your idea of backup?" "We don't usually take him with us, so yeah." Ethan rolled his eyes at her as they left the base, dodging around a few plumbers who shot them salutes as they carried equipment to and from the new main base. Grandpa Max wanted to keep it a surprise as much as possible, so they went back to their usual hangout and found Pierce working away on the main computer console. "Feel like busting some heads tonight, Pierce?" Pierce grinned. "Sounds good to me." Jen grinned and scribbled down the address. "Good. Meet us here tonight at 7, and bring some big guns. Something Ethan can handle." Pierce glanced at Ethan and nodded. "You got it, boss lady." Jen rolled her eyes. "I'm not your boss, Pierce. I just find the best fights in town." Gwen laughed as Ethan shook his head at his girlfriend. "You know, most people don't consider that a good thing." "Oh, it's not a good thing." She pecked Ethan on the lips. "It's a skill." With that, she headed for the elevator. Chapter 33, Bad Deal. Jen shook her head as she tossed her phone onto the couch and checked the clock on the wall. It was nearing 7. "Look, Gwen, I'm sorry, but we need to go now or we're going to miss the nights again, with or without Kevin." Gwen drummed her fingers on the arm of her chair. "This isn't like him. He normally keeps his badge on. I'm starting to get worried." A chuckle came from the doorway. "Worried about little old me?" They turned to the doorway and found Kevin standing there, just like he had been, except for the black eye. Jen stepped up to him and punched him in the shoulder. "Jackass, we've been worried about you." Then she blinked. Her hand didn't hurt like it normally did after punching Kevin. Gwen stepped forward. "What happened to your ID mask?" She reached up and touched his face. Her eyes went wide. I can feel your skin. Kevin, what happened?" Kevin paused and grinned. "No idea. Went to bed last night. Woke up like this." Jen frowned. "When did you go to bed last night?" Kevin raised an eyebrow. "I don't know. Early for me, I guess." Gwen frowned. "Is that why you didn't answer your phone?"
Why does it matter? He asked as he stepped further into the room. I'm better.
Yeah, and Jen collapsed last night. The doctors have no idea what happened or why.
Ethan said, standing up from his spot on the couch. And we're gonna be late to meet Pierce to catch the Knights. Jen swore. We can talk about this later. Let's go. They raced out. On their way to the warehouse, Kevin explained that he'd woken up without his powers, completely back to normal, and in his excitement walked into a door, resulting in his black eye. Jen wasn't so sure she believed him, though. They reached the warehouse just as Pierce pulled up. He hopped out and pulled a bag out of the cab of his truck. As ordered, one concussive cannon. Should be fun against the Knights. He opened the bag and handed the gun to Ethan, who nodded. Thanks. Kevin made a step forward towards the warehouse. Nope, you and Ethan bring up the rear. Without powers, it might be too dangerous for you, Jen stated, fiddling with the Omnitrix. Pierce frowned. When did he lose his powers? Last night, apparently, Jen said, still fiddling with the device around her wrist. Like the same time you fainted? Jen rolled her eyes at the word. Fainted. I didn't faint. I never lost consciousness. I collapsed. There's a difference. Ethan frowned. Not a big one. Kevin frowned. You passed out. No, look. We'll talk about this after. Kevin, stay back. Or better yet, stay by the car. We may need to make a quick getaway. Kevin frowned as the others made their way towards the warehouse. So I'm just the chauffeur now. What happens when you two get your licenses? Ethan shrugged. I mean, I already have mine. I'd share the gun, but Pierce only brought one. Yeah, man, I'd have brought another if I knew you wouldn't have your powers anymore. Next time, call me. They headed inside. It only took Kevin a few minutes to decide that this sucked. He was still a plumber, with or without his powers. He was going to do his job, so he went inside anyway and saved Gwen from a Forever Knight sneaking up behind her. Jen was swinging through the room as Spider Monkey. Between all of them, they took down the Forever Knights with ease. A few unmarked plumber vehicles picked up their captives as they headed back out, saluting them on the way. Still wish they wouldn't do that. Anyway, drop me home, please, Kev. He checked the clock. Why, it's only 9. She shrugged. Doc told me to take it easy. Ethan and I are going to hang at my place, watch bad alien horror movies. My mom's on a late shift and Dad's out of town again. Kevin bounced his eyebrows at her. In the rearview mirror. So you two want to be alone. Fair. Gives me time with your gorgeous cousin. He winked at Gwen and held out a hand. She barely laid her hand in his when she jerked it back. Actually, I have some school stuff I have to finish. Kevin frowned. You sure? I thought maybe we could go see a movie or something, now that I can be seen in public again. Gwen frowned at him. Kevin, I was never ashamed to be seen with you, ID mask or not. He frowned, but remained silent as he dropped them off, all at Jen's place at Gwen's insistence. Jen frowned as Kevin drove off. Everything okay, cuz? Gwen frowned. I need to go make sure Kevin didn't do something stupid. If you don't hear from me in an hour, track my badge. Ethan frowned. You sure you don't just want us to come with you? Gwen shook her head at him. No, I don't want him to see me coming. Jen nodded. Want who to see you coming? Not sure, but wait 1 hour before tracking me down, okay? Jen rolled her eyes, but agreed. Gwen left, racing off on her pink energy platforms. Jen pulled her necklace free of her shirt and tapped the side of it. A map popped up and a red dot appeared. Thought you agreed to wait an hour. Ethan teased, already pulling out the key fob for his bike. Yeah, well, Gwen's stressed. And when Gwen's stressed, rules need not apply. Something spooked her, and that's not easy to do. It also pissed her off, which is easy to do. Ethan laughed, retrieving their helmets from the newly arrived bike. You coming? You're not disappointed about the movie marathon, are you? Jen asked, looking up from the map in her hand. Ethan shrugged. Life with you is never that simple. He pulled on his helmet. Jen straddled the bike behind him, frowning as she pulled on her own helmet. That hadn't really been an answer, but she didn't have much time to think about it as they sped off after her cousin. Kevin was worried. From what Jen had described on the way back from the fight with the Knights, she'd gone through the same thing he'd gone through when Michael used the Dominus Librium on him to balance their power. The pain had been exceedingly bad, and Jen had gone through it at the same moment. He shook his head as he turned his car around and headed back to the warehouse. As it turned out, he was just in time. Ethan's bike was parked outside the fence. He scaled it as fast as he could as he spotted the lights flaring and flashing in the warehouse. By their standards, a clear fight. A very one-sided fight, too, with Michael using the Dominus Librium to drain the powers from both girls. Ethan was unconscious on the ground, nearly buried under a few prop pillars. "Gwen!" He didn't even think as he leapt forward, knocking Gwen out of the way of the beam from the Dominus Librium. 3 screams filled the room as gold light flared and the green light being drained from Jen spiked.